And this is where a lot of people get tripped up by false teachers who go to Matthew 5 and verse 17 through verse 19, and they teach them to remain under the laws that came through Moses. And let me show you this. Matthew 5, 17, starting verse 17. Do not think that I came to destroy the law and the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For surely I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass from the law till all is fulfilled. So in other words, the law is not going anywhere until it is fulfilled. And we fulfill the law through obeying Jesus. We fulfill the law through love. Love is the fulfillment of the law. We just read that in Romans chapter 13, verse 8 through verse 10. It's also in Galatians chapter 5, verse 13. Love is the fulfillment of the law. 19. Whoever therefore breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches men to do so shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does and teaches them shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. So, should we teach law? Yes, we should, for the purpose of leading people to Christ. Galatians chapter 3, verse 24. The purpose of the law is to lead people to Christ. Imagine that. So, should we teach law? Yes, we should. We should all know what the law is. And the law is covered in the laws that came through Moses are covered in the books of Deuteronomy, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. So we should know what it is. But if we follow the law to the letter, then according to Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 18 through 20, we will be looking for the prophet that Moses spoke of that was to come. And when that prophet came, we would have to obey him or be cut off from among the people. Peter, in Acts chapter 3, Peter identifies Jesus as being that prophet. So even if we follow the law to the letter, I mean down to the last T and dotted every I, then once Jesus came, we would now follow Jesus. Let's look at that. Acts chapter 3. Acts chapter 3, starting verse 22. For Moses truly said to the fathers, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brethren. Him you shall hear in all things, whatever he says to you. 23. And it shall be that every soul who will not hear that prophet shall be utterly destroyed from among his people. Whoever would not hear that prophet would be destroyed from among the people. So in Deuteronomy 18, we're looking for the prophet to come. In Acts chapter 3, Peter identifies Jesus as being that prophet. And you say, well, are you calling Jesus a prophet? Well, you would have to know Acts chapter 2, verse 36. Acts chapter 2, verse 36. Acts chapter 2, verse 36. Therefore let all the house of Israel know assuredly that God has made this Jesus, whom you crucified, both Lord and Christ. God made Jesus both Lord and Christ, and gave him the name that is above every name. That at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth. That's Philippians chapter 2. The law was 430 years after Abraham. 430 years later. So the law is not even a part of the covenant that are part of the promise that this covenant is based on. The law is not even a part of that. And therefore, those who are of the law are not heirs. Let's look at that. Romans chapter 4, verse 13. Romans chapter 4, verse 13. For the promise that he would be heir of the world was not to Abraham or his seed through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. The promise doesn't come through law, but through the righteousness of faith. Like I said, the law was 430 years later. 14. For if those who are of the law are heirs, faith is made void and the promise made of no effect. Imagine that. If those who are of the law are going, faith is made void. There's no use for faith. If we could obtain righteousness through the law, then why did Christ die? Galatians chapter 2, 19 through 21. 15, because the law brings wrath, for where there is no law, there is no transgressions. Imagine that. Law brings wrath, curses for disobeying the law, but where there's no law, there's no transgressions. So in other words, if you do away with the law, there's no account for sin. Romans chapter 5, verse 13. So apart from the law, sin is dead. Apart from the law, sin is totally dead. Not only that, but if we would get off from under the law, we would experience healing. Imagine that. That's why I wrote this book here, Stop Sinning and Be Healed. It explains that, how being under the law is connected to all types of sickness and disease that we could simply just do away with if we learn the truth and follow the truth. If we would just simply follow Jesus, obey Jesus, rather than trying to mix Moses with Jesus. All who are under the law are under a curse. Galatians chapter 3. Let's look at that. Galatians chapter 3, starting in verse 10. For as many who are of the works of the law are under the curse. For it is written, cursed is everyone who does not continue in the things which are written in the book of the law to do them. But that no one is justified by the law in the sight of God is evident. For the just shall live by faith. Those who are just, or those who are righteous in God's eyes, live by faith and not by law. They die to the law. Verse 12. Yet the law is not of faith, but the man who does these things shall live by them. The man who does these things shall live by them. So in other words, if you join a law-based organization who makes you obey part of the laws that came through Moses rather than fulfilling the law through faith in Jesus Christ, then you become obligated to obey the law. And you can eventually fall away from grace, according to Galatians 5, verse 1 through verse 4. Imagine that. If we attempt to be justified by law, we can fall away from grace. Imagine that. And that's happening all over even today. People are trying to be justified by law rather than justified by faith. Faith in Jesus Christ. Grace and truth came through Jesus. Law came through Moses. John chapter 1, verse 17. Before John the Baptist, the law was preached. But since that time, the kingdom of God is being preached. Luke 16, verse 16. And that's what we should be preaching. You know, we're ministers of a new covenant. You know, and we need to make that switch. So why are so many people still preaching the law in order to hold people under the law? Let's look at that. 1 Timothy chapter 1, starting verse 3. 1 Timothy chapter 1, starting verse 3. 1 Timothy chapter 1, starting verse 3. He says, I urge you when I went to Macedonia, remain in Ephesus, that you may charge some that they teach no other doctrine, nor give heed to fables and endless genealogies which cause disputes, rather than godly edification, which is in faith. Verse 5. Now the purpose of this commandment is love from a pure heart and a good conscience and from a sincere faith. Love comes from a pure heart, good conscience, and sincere faith. Imagine that. Verse 6. From which some, having strayed, have turned aside to idle talk. They've strayed from love, strayed from the faith, teaching the faith, and turned aside to idle talk. What kind of idle talk? Check this out. Verse 7. Desiring to be teachers of the law, understanding neither what they say, nor the things which they affirm. Imagine that. If I was a teacher of the law in order to hold you under the law, and my Bible said that I didn't know what I was talking about, that's kind of like a wake-up call. The purpose of the law is to lead us to Christ. if we're learning law and we never, if we're under the law and we never get to Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 18 and 19, which tells us that when the prophet comes, that we're to switch and obey the prophet, then what good is that? The purpose of the law is to lead us to Christ. Imagine that. Verse 7 again, desiring to be teachers of the law, understanding neither what they say nor the things which they affirm. Verse 8, but we know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully. Knowing this, that the law is not made for a righteous person. The law is not made for a righteous person. The law is not made for the people who are going to make it to heaven. According to Matthew chapter 5, verse 20, unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. We've covered that verse already. And we'll expand on that again in the next video. Let's read on down. Verse 9 again. Knowing that the law is not made for the righteous person, but for the lawless, the insubordinate, and for the ungodly, and for sinners, for the unholy, profane, for murderers of fathers, and murderers of mothers, for manslayers, verse 10, for fornicators, for sodomites, for kidnappers, for liars, perjurers, and if there is any other thing that is contrary to sound doctrine, according to the glorious gospel of the blessed God, which was committed to my trust. The law is for anything but the gospel. Imagine that. Imagine going to hear the gospel, but instead you're being held under the laws that came through Moses. Something is off. Something is way off. And because of that, Christians cannot stop sinning. Those who are still under the law are under sin. They cannot get off from under sin. We have to die to the law in order to live in the new way of the Spirit. We have to get off from under the old covenant and fulfill the old covenant through the new covenant. Christ is the end of the law for righteousness for everyone who believes. Christ is the end of the law for everyone who believes. Romans chapter 10, verse 4. Christ is the end of the law for righteousness for those who believe. So if you believe the things that we've covered so far, then it's time to switch covenants. It's time to fulfill the old covenant, get off from under the law through faith in Jesus Christ. Have faith in Jesus Christ. You know, one of the biggest problems is that if Jesus said if they believed Moses, they would believe me. One of the biggest problems is belief. We don't believe. John chapter 5, verse 46. John chapter 5, verse 46. For if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me. But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words? If you don't believe Moses in Deuteronomy 18 and 19, then how will you believe Jesus? Well, they don't. They just stay under the law and keep people under the law to do them. And those who do the works of the law in order to be justified by law eventually fall away from grace. And that's why preachers today make the 6 o'clock news. When we fall away from grace, fall away from ability, then sin is just rampant. You know, and it's all because we don't know the truth. God's people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, because we don't know something. Because we don't know. And we'll continue this discussion in the next video.